On the 24th of August, 2019, a 19-year-old university student named Uyinene Mrwetyana walked into a post office in Claremont, Cape Town, to collect a clothing parcel she had ordered online, and she never walked out. What happened inside that building on that Saturday afternoon was the act of one violent man, but the conditions that made it possible were the product of an entire system. A system that had the information it needed to prevent her death at multiple points, across multiple years, and chose at every turn to do nothing about it. Welcome to Unprotected by Design. In this series, we tell the stories of women and children whose lives were taken or shattered by violence, and examine the systems that were meant to protect them but failed, not just in their life, but even in their death. Today, we tell the story of Uyinene Mrwetyana. To understand what happened to Uyinene, you first have to understand who she was, not as a headline, not as a hashtag, but as a person living a full and deliberate life. She grew up in East London, in the Eastern Cape, and came to the University of Cape Town as a first-year student in 2019, studying film and media production, a subject she had chosen because she loved it. At Kingswood College, where she had been a top-performing student, she had sat on the student council, volunteered, played sports, and moved through her school years as the kind of person other people gravitated toward, not because she sought attention, but because she brought a warmth and certainty to every room she entered that made people feel like something was possible. Her family described her as fearless and outspoken, someone with a deep passion for fashion and travel, and an instinct to advocate that she turned both inward and outward for herself and for the people around her. She was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, someone with everything ahead of her. On the 8th of August, 2019, she called into the Claremont post office in Claremont to inquire about a clothing parcel she had ordered online and was waiting to receive. The parcel had not yet arrived, so she left her contact details with the man behind the counter. A teller named Uyinene bought her and asked him to let her know when it came in. It was the kind of brief and remarkable exchange that happens in post offices every single day, the kind none of us will remember by the time we reach the car, and she left without a second thought. Her parcel arrived on the 16th of August, and on the morning of the 24th, a Saturday, she made her way back to the Claremont post office to collect it. When she arrived, she was told power was out and to come back later. So she waited, and she returned, because that is what you do when a system tells you to wait, when you have no reason to distrust it, when you're 19 years old and the world has not yet given you cause to fear a post office in the middle of the afternoon. When she came back the second time, Uyinene was there alone. He let her inside, and he locked the door behind them. Uyinene fought back, and this is something her story demands we say clearly and hold on to because it matters. When Uyinene began to assault her, she did not go quietly. She screamed and she struggled, and in the middle of the assault, she managed to get back on her feet again and fight him. He knocked her unconscious, raped her twice, and then he took a post office scale and bludgeoned her to death with it. The cause of her death was a fatal head injury. He then hid her body inside the post office safe overnight, returned the following day, placed her remains in the boot of his car, drove to Lingeletu West in Khayelitsha, and burned and buried what was left of her in a shallow grave. 2 days after the murder, he walked into the shop across the street from the post office and asked the employees to show him their CCTV footage, telling them that a generator had been stolen outside and he needed to check the cameras. They showed him, and he could see that although the cameras faced the post office, they did not reach the entrance. He had covered what he needed to cover, and then he went back to work. What Uyinene did not know when she handed Uyinene her contact details on the 8th of August What she had no way of knowing, because the institution that employed him had made a deliberate series of choices to not find out who he was, is that Bota had a criminal record. In 1998, more than 20 years before he murdered her, he had been convicted of carjacking, sentenced to 8 years in prison, and released after serving 5, with 3 years suspended. He had been a convicted violent criminal who had served time and been returned to society, and years later, the South African Post Office had hired him, placed him behind a counter in a government building, and given him daily access to members of the public who had no idea who they were dealing with. He was not screened when he was first appointed as a part-time employee through a labor broker, and he was not screened in 2016 when he moved into a permanent teller position, the role he held on the day he murdered Uyinene. At each stage of his employment, he was asked to declare whether he had a criminal record. At each stage, he lied, and at each stage, the post office accepted his word without verifying a single thing. A preliminary investigation conducted after Uyinene's death would later confirm that his appointment had not followed their routine recruitment process at any point. More damning still, an intelligence report flagging Bota's criminal conviction had existed within the institution for more than a year before Uyinene walked through that door. Someone had that information, the post office had that information, and it sat there, unactioned, while he continued to show up to work every day. After the murder, a woman named Alice Cropper came forward to say that just days before Uyinene was killed, she had gone to the same post office and been served by the same man, and that he had tried to persuade her to leave and return later, claiming the card machine was not working. Something about that interaction had unsettled her, and she had left. She was lucky and she knew it, and the weight of that knowledge was something she carried into the public conversation that followed Uyinene's death. But Alice Cropper's near miss was not even the earliest warning the system had about Luyanda Botha, because in June of 2014, 5 years before he murdered Uyinene, he had visited the Atloni Nursing College, found a woman alone taking a bath, and attempted to rape her. A case was opened, and then the justice system did what it had become practiced at doing with cases involving violence against women. It moved slowly, it postponed repeatedly, it stretched across years and then across a decade until in January 2025, 11 years after the alleged crime and more than 5 years after Uyinene's murder, Luyanda Botha was found not guilty. The system had taken 11 years to acquit a convicted murderer and rapist of an earlier attempted rape case. Uyinene had been dead for 5 of those years. When police searched Botha's home after his arrest, they found a shallow grave in the backyard containing human remains believed to belong to his wife. The man who had been handed keys to a government building and trusted to serve the public had a trail of violence that ran in multiple directions across multiple years, and not one of the institutions designed to track, screen, or monitor people like him had managed to put that information where it could do any good. Uyinene had been reported missing on the 26th of August, 2 days after she had disappeared, and from the moment that alert went out, it was not the institutions that had moved with the most urgency, it was her people. Friends from UCT, from Kingswood College, from East London, young people who had grown up with her, studied with her, loved her, printed missing persons posters with her face on them, and walked the streets of Cape Town, asking strangers if they had seen her, going door to door, searching clubs and bars, doing it with their own hands and determination, what the official response had not yet managed to do in speed or in urgency. They launched the hashtag #BringNene which spread across social media with the kind of velocity that only happens when a story touches something people already know to be true. pulling in celebrities, public figures, and thousands of ordinary South Africans who understood without being told that this disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Prayer groups gathered in Cape Town, in East London, at Stellenbosch University and Wits. People sitting together at the foot of mountains, sending their prayers into the air for a girl they had never met, because the alternative, sitting alone with the fear, was unbearable. On the 31st of August, the Pink Ladies organization confirmed what the country had been bracing for. Uyinene Mrwetyana was deceased, and a murder case had been opened. On the 2nd of September, 9 days after she had gone to collect a parcel, her family stood outside the Wynberg Magistrates Court as the man believed to be responsible was brought in for his first appearance. Her aunt shook her head when asked whether she believed Uyinene might have been murdered. She still hoped, even then, because hope was the only thing left to hold on to. A placard held outside the court gates read, "Where is our Uyinene?" And inside, the state told the family that Luyanda Botha had been charged with rape, murder, and defeating the ends of justice, and that he had already confessed, had already told investigators what he had done and where to find her. Uyinene's murder did not happen in isolation, and the country's response to it did not happen in isolation either. In that same month of August 2019, Women's Month in South Africa, 14-year-old Janika Malo was raped and had her head bashed in. The dismembered body of Lynette Volsheng was found in bags in her flat. Boxing champion Leandre Jagels was shot dead by her former boyfriend, and youth leader Jessie Hairs was found murdered in her family home alongside her 85-year-old grandfather. These were just but a few of the cases that made the news. The stories that broke through the noise of a country that had been living with femicide statistics so severe that a woman was being murdered every 3 hours, and where murder overall had risen 35% in 7 years. South African women had been reporting, marching, petitioning, and mourning for years, and the numbers had kept climbing. And then, in the middle of all of it, the government's social media account posted that women should not allow themselves to become victims. A statement so tone-deaf, issued at such a moment that it crystallized something the country had been struggling to name, that the institutions meant to protect women were not just failing them, but had stopped pretending to take that failure seriously. On the 3rd of September, #AmINext began trending, and by the morning of the 4th, thousands of people were in the streets of Cape Town, dressed in black. Students, learners, men, women, and children holding placards that read "Stop killing us" and "Enough is enough," marching from UCT's Sarah Batsman Plaza to the Cape Town International Convention Center, where President Cyril Ramaphosa was hosting the World Economic Forum on Africa with delegates from around the world. They broke through the police barricades to be heard. The police responded with stun grenades and tear gas, and 11 protesters were arrested, 8 of them women. Protests followed at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, where demonstrators demanded that listed companies set aside 2% of their profits to tackle gender-based violence. South Africans gathered in Times Square in New York. The grief and the rage of one country had crossed an ocean, and it could not be ignored. On the 5th of September, President Ramaphosa came out of the convention center and stood with the protesters outside Parliament, and later that day, he addressed the nation with a series of commitments: harsher minimum sentences for crimes against women and children, the public disclosure of the National Sex Offenders Registry, a directive that the state would oppose bail and parole applications for convicted rapists and murderers, and a review of existing withdrawn rape cases against Botha specifically on the president's direct instruction. UCT suspended classes for 2 days. A country that had been told for years to grieve quietly had decided that it would not. On the 15th of November 2019, Luyanda Botha stood before Western Cape High Court judge, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 3 life terms, 1 for murder, 2 for rape, and an additional 5 years for defeating the ends of justice. He will be eligible for parole in 25 years. In a 4-page admission read aloud by his counsel, he gave a detailed account of what he had done, and Uyinene's family sat in that courtroom and listened to every word. On the 29th of November, the Uyinene Mrwetyana Foundation was launched in Makanda, in the Eastern Cape, her home, with the purpose of honoring her life, preventing gender-based violence, supporting survivors, and investing in the next generation of people who will refuse to be silent. A scholarship was established in her name for women in the humanities faculty at UCT, and in 2021, Lulanganiso Majebe became its first recipient, walking across the UCT graduation stage in 2025. Every year, the foundation holds a walk in Uyinene's memory, and every year, South Africans return to her name, not because they're told to, but because her story settled into the national consciousness in a way that refuses to leave. Because people understand, even when they cannot fully articulate it, that what happened to her was not a tragedy in the sense of something that could have not been prevented. It was a consequence. A consequence of a post office that hired a man with a violent criminal conviction, without conducting a single background check, that accepted a signed declaration from him without verifying it, and that received an intelligence report flagging his record and left it unactioned for over a year while he continued to show up to work. A consequence of a parole system that released a convicted criminal back into society without any meaningful tracking of where he had ended up or what access he was given. A consequence of a justice system that took 11 years to process a prior attempted rape charge and then acquitted him, leaving a clear pattern of predatory behavior issues unaddressed and unpunished. And a consequence of a state that was confronted with evidence of all this after the fact and expressed shock, as though shock itself were not the most troubling part, as though an institution should be permitted to be surprised by the results of its own negligence. Uyinene Mrwetyana followed every step the system asked of her. She filled in the right forms, left her details with the right person, came back when she was told to come back, and trusted the building she was told to trust. She did everything right. The system, at every point where it could have done something, chose not to, and she paid for those choices with her life. Uyinene was 19 years old. She was fearless. She had everything ahead of her, yet she was unprotected. Not by chance, not by accident, but by design. We send our deepest condolences to Uyinene's friends and family and to all of those who loved her. May she rest in eternal peace. Her name was Uyinene Mrwetyana. We say her name. Thank you for joining us today. As always, if this story moved you, share it. The stories that don't make the headlines still deserve to be heard. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of one another.